Well, these were great questions so far. I'm going to open up to now our expert panel of clinicians here who are going to join me and Dr. Paganoni. And I'll say a couple words just to introduce people, but I think some of the faces are quite familiar. And are we going to have Dr. Wolfe come up? Perfect. So first, I'm just going to just say that about myself. I came to Chicago. I'm a rehab physician scientist who does neuromuscular medicine as well. In that sense, I have a lot in common with Dr. Paganoni because she was kind of the original rehab physician to cross over. Not the only one, but she was the person who caught my eye and was a big part of me choosing this pathway. In fact, I ran into her at one of our academy meetings before I had finished residency and spoke to her after her presentation on ALS. And I can't remember the topic, but it was probably about why rehabilitation matters for ALS patients, which is a great topic as well. She's been involved in so many different things over the years. And she was the one who first told me, if you're going to really do this and have credibility, you got to do the subspecialization, do the neuromuscular fellowship, and commit that extra, time and effort to it. And I initially was, a little bit scared because I had also committed a lot of time to research training and so forth, but it actually stuck with me. Initially, I thought, I don't know about that. I remember even saying something back, but it really mattered that she gave me her honest advice, frank advice at the time, and it planted the seed that then kind of grew. And the other two people on the panel, I pointed this already out to Doctors Driss and Wolfe in talking about it, but Dr. Wolfe, for some reason, and I'll say this about her as a pulmonologist in her clinic who's focused on neuromuscular diseases. We're so privileged to have her and Dr. Coleman, who care so much about our patients. Not every place in the country has that, and we have two, and we're maybe a third on the way, but I won't make any announcements today. So, but she, for some reason, always really thought of me as like, he's got to come into the fold join the ALS group, and she liked me, and she promoted me to Dr. Sadiq and Dr. Driss at every chance and Dr. Suff at every chance she did when I was training. So I'm grateful for her, and everyone knows Dr. Wolfe because she's such a big part of everyone's care, at least half of our patients, if not more. And then, of course, the final part of it to me is the person I probably learned the most from clinically in neuromuscular medicine is Dr. Driss, who, thinking back, I probably was a little awkward talking to her about, because the fellowship I was talking about, well, I really want to do some unusual things that I hadn't quite figured it out between research, my angle as a rehab physician, and she wasn't bothered by it at all. In fact, in retrospect, I really wasn't trying to sell her on me as much as figure out what I want to do with my life. And I think what she saw was, and the way that we've done things at Northwestern, starting from the very beginning, Dr. Heller, Dr. Sadiq, who came afterwards, and stuff, is that we've always wanted to be leaders and have original thought and different approaches in the clinic. And I think eventually I came around, and she got a hold of me and taught me how to do things the right way. But I think what she liked and what I see as a common feature amongst a lot of our team here is that we just want to be leaders in ALS care, research, and taking things with our research team in our clinical team and do things differently. So I think we're really at a special place, and I think that it's wonderful having someone else from another special place at MGH and at Spaulding with Dr. Paganoni here. So we've got a great panel. We've got lots of questions already that have come in. We're going to have more questions coming in through Q&A, and I'm just going to get things started. And obviously, I've been doing a lot of talking, but I'll shut up right now and actually let my panelists do some of the talking. So I'm going to start off with a question for Dr. Driss. And this is a question that I think it's been coming up a bit about, how do I get involved in clinical trials? I live in Chicago. I live in the Chicago, the surrounding area, or I live somewhere else in the country or even the world. Can you just talk about on those different levels? Because we've had people all over the world here, but we've got lots of people in our area as well, about how they could find out more about getting involved with ALS clinical trials.
Very good. Thank you, Colin. Thank you. We're happy to have you. We're happy to have you both. This is great to have people from a rehab background become leader in the ALS world. This is really amazing. It's a great pleasure to have you, Sabrina, and I'm glad, Colin, you kind of drank the Kool-Aid too. So on a different note, I want to just comment on the COVID question. And we also thought about that, and we're happy that our patients were not negatively impacted by the disease. And we put together the telemedicine very quickly, and I don't think the care was impacted in any way. But I think what ALS patients do very well, even before the COVID pandemic, they social distance very well. They are afraid of many other upper respiratory infection, so they keep to themselves. And it's unfortunate because of the disease, they are also isolated, which comes now as a kind of a silver lining. So I think maybe that has to do with it, why our population has not been affected negatively. But of course, this is pure speculation, and we don't really have good data about that. Now, about the clinical trial, I think the first place to start have this discussion about clinical trial is really your physician, your neurologist. That's the first person to ask and to have a discussion with about in your stage of the disease, whether you're early, whether you're in the later stages, whether you have a slow or a fast progression disease, is that honest conversation about what's next. I would like also take this opportunity and emphasize that clinical trials are important, but clinical care is also important. We should not really, we should pay attention to the things that we do to improve any symptom of the disease that are very, very important. And we do a lot, and Dr. Wolfe probably will talk about that later. Some of the things that we take for granted are very, very important, slowing down the progression of the disease. However, for clinical trial, again, I mean, you talk to your physician first. We have a good research coordinator in the clinic that can talk to you about what's going on in our clinic. To know what's happening in the world or in the US, there is very good website. We were working very closely with the Les Turner Foundation to have one site where you can go to and you can see what's going on in our clinic. I know AMALS are working on a tool to make it easy for patients to find clinical trial that are close to them. Clinicaltrial.gov is the other thing. The NEALS website has another one. Every single organization has a website that will go over a clinical trial, and I understand how overwhelming this be from a patient perspective. So definitely take a step back, talk to your neurologist. I'm sure you'll find the guidance there.
Great. And then I'm going to just give everyone a chance to talk, and then I see the comments coming through, and I'll do my best to kind of alternate back and forth. But I have a question for Dr. Wolfe. One of the comments that was pre-submitted questions, it was a statement that it was hard to keep coming in to see my physician in the ALS clinic, especially as time has gone on. Can you talk about what's the benefits of the clinic and what do you get from a multidisciplinary care as opposed to getting care locally from an individual provider?
Yeah, absolutely. Colin, can you hear me?
We sure can.
Okay, great. I'm going to pull a Senda here, and I'm also going to answer the COVID question first, if that's okay.
That's okay. I don't mean to stifle you guys.
My answer is going to be very different than what you heard from the neurologists. The issue is not the risk of patients with ALS getting COVID. The problem is what happens to patients with neuromuscular diseases that are admitted to hospitals. Two of the things that hospitals are doing nationally is to pull non-invasive ventilation, to say, I don't care that you're using NIV and that you've been using it a long time. We think that it spreads COVID and we won't let you use it. That's a big problem. The second problem is that as a part of COVID, patients produce a lot of mucus and secretions, and there's destruction of the cartilaginous structures of the lung that help make it so that as you cough, it's hard to get those secretions out. And so what I would say to any patient with ALS who's listening to this, one of the things that you need to do proactively is to find your champion. You need to have your clinic's pulmonologist or someone who is close to your program, maybe an anesthesiologist, go to your hospital and say, we need an exception for our patients with ALS. If they come in with COVID, you cannot pull their equipment from them. Patients with ALS need to be instructed that if they come to the hospital, bring their own PAP. If you bring your own stuff, it's less likely to be pulled. And then from our perspective at Northwestern, together with Emory, we're doing a clinical trial right now with a special form of airway clearance in COVID that's called the MetaNeb machine or the Velara machine. We've specially retrofitted it so that patients with neuromuscular disease can get the airway clearance they need in COVID without making an increased risk for the caregivers around them. And so I need to put out a shout both for non-invasive ventilation and airway clearance. Okay, so that's my free advertising. So moving on to the actual question, I will say that we have been very aggressive at using telehealth in terms of remote monitoring for our PAP machines. You know, even if a patient isn't in the office, I can, with a couple of strokes on the computer, say, hey, this is what's going on with their breathing. This is how well they're using their airway clearance. I've got an idea of what's going on. The problem is, if you don't physically come to clinic and there's an issue or a problem, getting it resolved can be a problem. So if you need a mask refitted, if you need to have your pressures adjusted, a lot of that is super challenging to do. And if we think more broadly, it's the multidisciplinary nature of the care that you get in clinic that's very, very difficult to replicate over telehealth. And I'll tell you, I have been fortunate to have first met Sabrina and Colin with my work at the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago, now called the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. And having worked in an environment with physiatry, you appreciate the fact that this needs to be a multi-system, multi-therapy approach. And you just can't recreate that as well over telehealth.
Great. And I think we'll segue on the telehealth thing. So telemedicine's really become obviously a big part of our practices this year. And it had been actually, ALS clinics were one of the areas where it was being tested out early on, at least at Northwestern, just because of the special needs of our patients. And I guess bringing that together and, because participating in clinical trials can be demanding on the participants, on the patients with ALS. So how are we using telehealth with our current clinical trial designs? What modifications have been made so that people can use telemedicine as part of their follow-up visits for research? And I'll ask that to Sabrina. Dr. Paganoni, sorry.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm not familiar with the way you use telehealth at Northwestern. I understand you have a very robust program, which is great. I can tell you, we also use telemedicine a lot. So I think it's really phenomenal to see how the sort of all the changes that COVID has basically has had on has caused in terms of telemedicine will ultimately have an impact not only on clinical care but also trials. So, for example, for the platform trial, we modified the protocol after COVID started to allow optional telemedicine visits for some visits, if possible, because we wanted to be able to make the trial COVID resilient. So I think that's a trend that we're seeing across all of medicine, where both clinical care and research are basically adapting to the new reality, and so making changes to protocols and procedures so that we can deliver care and research both safely and effectively, and not be too worried about potential new surgeries, etc., which obviously can happen, unexpectedly and in different parts of the country at different times. I don't know if that's what you were looking for in terms of the general question, but we can discuss the specifics if helpful.
Listen, I think that was a good answer, and we'll see if the audience has any other questions or follow-ups on it. I have a question. So I think one of the things that's coming up is how the different levels of ALS organizations, stakeholders, patient and led and otherwise, and it's I think I've seen it improve over the years since I've been involved. I started ALS research myself around 2007. But how they could work better together, what is being done so that we have more collaboration. We see a little bit about NEALS, we see a little bit about the multi-center trials, but how can we get it so that the ALS, and this is for Dr. Driss, that the organizations across the country, that they work better together, that we get more efficient results, and also how does someone who's diagnosed with ALS find the best place to kind of get plugged into a multidisciplinary clinic and so forth. So how can we make it easier for people?
A good question, and difficult to answer. For us, once you, we've been working on our website. So when you look for ALS in Chicago, you get some meaningful information. And I'm sure if you get connected with the Les Turner Foundation, you will end up in our clinic. You could be referred to our clinic from your physician or neurologist that you see. It can be sometimes a journey for patients, especially if they live a little bit further away from the city or in more rural area with difficult access. I think, again, going online is the way to do it. I think it's getting better since 2007. I think all the organizations are actually trying to working together. The document, the guidance for the FDA had required a lot of people to come together, and really we're all in it. The clinician, the researcher, the patient, and the foundation or the advocacy groups are all in it for one purpose, is to actually find a cure for this disease, basically, and improve the life of the ALS patient. I'm sure we could work and make sure that our clinic is more visible, and the Les Turner Foundation and Northwestern are trying to do that, so it's easy for patients to find us and get involved with us.
Great. And I have a question for Dr. Wolfe, and it's a short one, but it's a big one. Should my husband get a tracheostomy?
Yeah, that's not such a short one.
Well, it was short to read.
Okay. And again, I'm going to take a second to put a shout out to both Sabrina and Senda's questions. And for Sabrina, in terms of how does telehealth change in terms of research, and Sabrina doesn't even know this yet, but one of the things that's happened because of this is a push to do spirometry testing in the home so that patients can stay part of the trial and we can still track how they're doing. And I'm currently working on a committee with Medicare to rewrite all the guidelines for the use of NIV in neuromuscular disease, who's eligible for what, when. And one of the changes we've put through is to now make home spirometry testing an eligible test to get all of this equipment clinically. And so I have to say to Sabrina, it's great because it's making a huge impact, not only on the research part, but what we're going to do clinically. So kudos for that. And then in terms of Senda, in terms of the issues of how do we all work together, one of the best things that I've seen in my years of doing this is when I first started doing it, I was like there were like 5 pulmonologists in the country that were doing this. And now what we're seeing is that if you look at multidisciplinary clinics and you look at OT and PT and speech and pulmonary medicine, what we're starting to see is that if you go to the American Thoracic Society meeting or you go to the chest meeting, there's the group that takes care of ALS patients, and no matter which organization their clinic is under, when we get to our subspecialty meetings, we are one group and we're growing significantly. So I think that that's one great way that that's been happening. In terms of the tracheostomy, that's a super hard question. I'm going to tell you statistically in the US, 95% of patients with ALS choose not to have a tracheostomy. We know that there are some people who are more likely to get a tracheostomy, and that includes people who are younger and have fewer health problems altogether. and also includes African Americans, for which we're not really sure what those issues are, but I will say that part of them are likely an access to care issue in terms of not having equal access to care to NIV, and also probably some issues with bias. And I think that ultimately we will need to think about how that plays a role in these decisions, and ongoing research is going to need to look at that. And if we look at what are the medical issues that make us say tracheostomy is necessary, it's clearance of secretions. We should never look at tracheostomy just for supporting ventilation. We have many patients who can go non-invasively 24 hours a day for years. And if we can do that, we prefer it because it reduces care costs, it reduces burden to caregivers, and it allows more options in terms of where a patient can live at home. But if there are lots of secretions and the patient can't handle their own secretions, that's when the discussion of tracheostomy has to be made.
Well, I'm reading the questions here. If someone's looking forward to the next day, then you need air, so get a trach, but a NIV is good as well. So there's some comments coming in. You could read in the questions and answer. That wasn't a question, but I'll keep looking out for the questions. I do have another question as well for Sabrina. A big question that expands on a lot of the exciting trials that are underway, and is what else is coming down the pipeline. So we talked a bit about platform, we talked about Centaur. What else is out there? And I think people really are curious about things and about gene therapies, and there's a lot of questions about stem cells. So I'm kind of putting them together as like kind of what other things should we be, should people know about these trials are happening, and anything else that's kind of close to being considered for approval right now?
Yeah, no, those are important questions. I would say that at this time, there are several trials that are in the late stages, meaning that they are designed in a way that would allow the approval of new drugs if the results are positive. So they're large enough or long enough to be able to support registration of new drugs, obviously assuming that the results are good. So of those, I would say that, certainly, I think there is a lot of attention these days on genetic forms of the disease, including people with SOD1 mutations and C9 mutations and some FAS mutations as well. There are antisense oligonucleotide trials that are in the late stages. So hopefully we will know over the next few months or a couple of years whether those drugs can affect the disease progression and survival for those groups of patients. Now, I would say that the other thing that those trials, the antisense oligonucleotides and the gene therapy trials for people with familial forms of ALS are also doing is that they are helping us develop better technology to turn off or modulate genes. So obviously the most sort of immediate candidate is a genetic mutation, for example, SOD1 or C9. But then keep in mind that the same technologies are now being repurposed in a way to turn off or modulate other genes, such as ataxin-2 and potentially more genes that could be relevant for a larger share of the population. So in other words, while only 10% of people with ALS have a defined disease-causing genetic mutation, there's a lot of people that have little changes here and there in different genes that can increase their risk. Perhaps each of these small changes is not enough to cause disease, but in combination, they'll cause disease in the individual and give rise to sporadic ALS, where the disease doesn't run in that family, but there are certainly certain genetic predisposition factors and other things that together contribute to disease. So essentially, sort of this technology with gene therapy, gene modulation, antisense oligonucleotides is now really in the final stages of research for some specific genetic mutations. But once the technology is worked out it could be applicable to other genetic mutations that are not being studied right now. Obviously, the industry is working first on the most common ones like SOD1 and C9, but if the technological barrier is overcome, then I would expect that more rare mutations would be targeted as well. And on top of that, we can hopefully learn how to modulate genes in a safe way, even for sporadic ALS, for things that are more genetic modifiers of the disease or risk factors for the disease. So I think that's certainly something to really pay attention to. In terms of stem cells, stem cells now, as you know, there is a phase 3 trial of Brainstorm, which is a form of stem cells that's gonna end by the end of the year, I believe. So I'm not directly involved, so I don't know exactly when the results will be shared, but I believe they're gonna be shared soon. And so that's gonna be important because that will tell us sort of this specific intervention, what's the impact of the intervention on efficacy. And there were previous small trials, but it's important to confirm the results and make sure that the trial is really, a phase 3 trial before basically we can, sort of decide if that particular therapeutic works or not. Regardless of whether it's positive or negative, I think this is just one page in the big book of stem cell research, which is important for ALS. So there's going to be other stem cell products, I'm sure, whether this particular trial is positive or negative. And so it remains to be seen. So I think that's another area of interest. The last thing is, in one of my first slides, I showed that there's a number of phase 3 trials that are going on in the US and elsewhere. And so obviously, because they're late stage trials, they're large enough and long enough to be able to fully assess the efficacy of the respective drug. Those are going to be important. And so it's important that people keep in touch and talk to their physicians about the results of these trials. Some of them, I believe the arimoclomol trial will have results in early 2021. For others, it might take a few more months. But the good news is that they are making progress. And I think we cannot take it for granted given COVID. I mean, I think it's remarkable that all these trials are continuing to enroll, and there's a lot of efforts going on, both from ALS clinics, institutions, hospitals, companies, to really keep these trials going, even in the middle of a pandemic. So I think it's remarkable that we can continue to make progress and test more drugs. In addition, there's also a number of other trials, as I said earlier. So I don't think there's one trial over, there's not only one good trial or one promising trial. Oftentimes people ask, which is the best trial, which is the most promising trial. I really think it's impossible to compare. I think all the drugs that are in phase 2 to 3, they are there because there's good science behind it. And so then we just need to test as many as possible. And every time a trial ends, that's good news because, whether they're positive or negative, it's a step forward. So we need to be able to test many drugs, and then of those, some will be positive and some will not be, but it's important to continue to test them.
Thank you. And now I have a question. I'm going to send this one to Dr. Driss. So a new ALS patient in this time of COVID needs to be assessed. How do we do our initial screening? Is this in person? Can you do it by telemedicine? And then where do you go after that?
Very good. So I would prefer an initial screening per person unless it's really a lockdown and we cannot leave our houses. I think the hospitals are safe. There is a lot of screening that happens when you come in. They screen everybody. They limit the size of people that are in. They take temperature. So I believe that coming to the clinic, knowing that we all used all the precaution is safe. And I understand that patients are really worried and they don't want to be near hospital. Telemedicine is very good, but one thing we cannot do through telemedicine is really accurately examine a patient. So if patient coming for an assessment, for a first assessment, that physical exam is very important. Now, if the patient is coming from a second opinion and has been assessed already, had an EMG, had multiple labs, that may be done through telemedicine, but still it's not ideal. We certainly have done that with our patient. I want to reassure the patient that we, in the hospital, we all are wearing masks. We wash our hands 100 times a minute, and we are very careful. Our rooms are cleaned. We have specific room where we measure breathing, so we make sure that if we measure the breathing, we can have these aerosols, and we want to make sure that somebody who goes in that room afterward doesn't get exposed, and that if that would happen. So we have specific rooms with negative flows that we measure the breathing in. We try to measure breathing unless we really have to, and it's important. So we have a lot of precautions. So I think coming to the hospital is safe. So far, we haven't heard of anybody contract COVID just because they traveled to see us in the clinic. But telemedicine is also a possibility, not as good as the in-person visit, but of course it does the work when there is no other option.
Now, I have some more questions coming in. I have one that was submitted in advance that I liked it. It was another short to the point one. It said exercise, friend or foe, with a question mark. And so I actually just gave a webinar on this topic that's available through the Ability Lab. They're doing a neurological series, but I also, in that webinar, I'm pretty sure I cited one of Sabrina's review papers that she did for Muscle and Nerve about why rehabilitation matters, although she doesn't talk only about exercise, but she talked about a lot of rehabilitation issues there. But maybe I'll take a stab at it, and then feel free, anyone, to add on. So I think historically, the reason that there's even been a question about why you would restrict activity or exercise in ALS was one of anecdote, that people would quote unquote either overdo it and then have a decline in function, and that was associated with maybe an event of overexertion that you would hear about from other clinicians that might inform decision making. There's also the fact that I think that it's hard to the disease is known as Lou Gehrig's disease, and Lou Gehrig is obviously was at his time one of the best baseball players that ever lived, but also at that time at the peak of his career when he was afflicted with the disease. And we see multiple examples: Steve Gleason, Pete Frates, who come to mind. In Canada, where I'm from, Tony Proudfoot, a CFL player with ALS, and many others over time. So there is this sort of observation, if you will, that athletes, particularly those who played contact sports, boxing, football, American style or European, may develop the ALS at a higher rate. Also, those members of the military who served in the Gulf War, and there's been work beyond that. So it does raise the question about this, what is this about these associations we see? On the other hand, I've noted how careful and how appropriately so Dr. Paganoni is when she's talking about what we can say about what we know, even from her well-designed clinical trial studies, and being careful not to overstate what we know or don't know. But I can tell you that we have to be careful about how, we don't want to hurt anyone. But on the other hand, when you really look, and in the last 3 years, there's been 5 more clinical trials published with randomization looking at different forms of exercise, either resistive or aerobic, and on top of the 2 prior. So there's now 7 studies, over 300 patients who've been included in these studies with ALS who've been received exercise versus other kind of usual care as comparisons. And the overwhelming conclusion of the most recent meta-analysis, although there hasn't been a new Cochrane review, which is the kind of gold standard of meta-analysis, systematic reviews, but the most recent kind of polling of that is that, if anything, we can say that exercise has been extremely safe in people with ALS. Very hard to really prove that you're creating an increase of risk of a negative outcome. Now, this is a disease that can progress, so people continue to progress. It's not a cure. And so that's not, but then if you look at the slope of progression and in terms of patients' function, both pulmonary as well as measures of physical function, there may actually be a protective effect that comes out of the pooling that data. So it's really interesting out of things that the risks that we're willing to take in other places, having things injected or having more invasive therapeutics. You look at some of the things that could be done or considered on a case-by-case basis with things that have very low risk and that are probably underprescribed. And I think one of the approaches I've taken, talking to my patients or occasionally other people's patients, is that we can look at personalized exercise programs for patients if they're interested. We don't have to push it too hard. We don't have quite the data to say that everyone needs to be doing the same exercises. And in fact, the hardest thing about prescribing exercise, and the reason we often use expert physical therapy evaluation with one of the therapists at the Ability Lab who's particularly interested patients and working with patients with ALS is that you have to figure out what someone can do, what they can do safely, and what they're interested in, and then really match up a program that's tailored to them, not to mention talk to them about the appropriate intensity of the exercises and the type of exercises they do, which we could get into a little bit more, particularly that the studied intensities have been at the moderate level, either aerobic or resistive, and sort of building on that data to kind of make some personalized, talk about personalized medicine. We think about gene therapies, but also personalized medicine in terms of how we manage people's functional deficits. Dr. Paganoni, do you have anything to add about that, or would you?
Yeah, no, I think you presented that super well. Yeah, absolutely. And I think also in addition to sort of what we think normally as exercise, again, aerobic exercise, or resistive exercises, I think, many of these exercises can be modified and are important for general musculoskeletal health and to prevent pain or other complications. So again, work with your clinic therapist, doctor, to really incorporate that, for maximum benefit.
Colin, can I just say one thing real quick about that?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that we are very big fans of is range of motion. And I'm going to put that in the range or in the overall grouping with rehabilitation and strength training, even though it's really not muscle training per se. We know that if we can do full range of motion on any given joint, that we're reducing adhesions, scar tissue, risk of frozen shoulder, say. But if we look specifically at the chest wall, looking at the role of the sternum and the ribs, we know that if we do lung volume recruitment exercises on a daily basis, that it does slow down reduction in forced vital capacity. And that's really good data from Doug McKim's lab in Ottawa. And we are one of the only programs in the country that's taken this on. But all of our patients are given lung volume recruitment exercise from the time of diagnosis. And a big part of that is chest wall range of motion. And in addition to that, they're going to get lung volume recruitment, right? So you're getting 2 for 1. And the question is, where's the huge benefit? But we know that if we do chest wall range of motion, then any activity that they do for deep cough or deep breathe is done with less resistance. And with less resistance, no matter how much force you can generate, you're going to get a larger volume on that cough. And that's the thing that reduces complication. And so we do recommend nice range of motion.
Question, this one's coming from the audience, and I'm going to put it out there for anyone to take, so I don't put anyone on the spot. But I think it's a great question, especially because we have a tremendously well-developed registry for historically for, from the legacy of what the Les Turner Foundation's provided for funding research, people with ALS and other related diseases. One of the related diseases that we often, I feel like, don't talk about enough is PLS, primary lateral sclerosis. And so as we talk about these drug trials, everything that's happening for people who meet the criteria for ALS, what can we do about the people with PLS in terms of advising them about being involved with some of these research studies for either therapeutic drugs or even using drugs that have been developed for ALS patients? Can they be extrapolated to patients with PLS? And so I'll put that out there. I think that's a great question.
I love the question. So if you don't mind, I'm happy to address it first, but then I welcome everyone's input. For many of us, I know also for the other panelists, we have a great interest in PLS, and really we all love working with people with PLS. We've been involved in different registries and other projects. So I think the time has come for PLS. Really, we have finally great momentum. As many of you know, we had a meeting, an international meeting that really kicked off a few projects. That was in 2019. We're now going to host another one every 2 years. Basically, it's going to be every other year. There's going to be a dedicated conference on PLS. There's many groups such as Northwestern. We also have a great interest at the Healy Center. There's foundations, Les Turner you mentioned, as well as the Spastic Paraplegia Foundation and other groups that really have all come together, just like we're coming together in ALS, as others have mentioned. There's a lot of groups that are coming together for PLS. I know that, it's going to take some time, especially because really a big gap for PLS is that we don't have great outcome measures, meaning how to measure the results of an intervention. Especially because PLS progresses over a long period of time. So because of that, in order to see the effect of an intervention, trials will need to be longer by definition, which is complicated to do, unless we develop better biomarkers that are predictive of the clinical impact. So there's a lot of efforts on that. I can tell you that, for some of these drugs, we have started kind of a conversation about, potential for PLS. It's going to take some time, but the good news is that the community is now really thinking about PLS as part of the drug development process. Again, it's going to take some time, but there's certainly a group of people, including many people on the line, that are working in that field.
And I see, I think this is a quick answer. Nudexta, we mentioned edaravone, we mentioned riluzole, and Nudexta is approved for pseudobulbar affect in ALS patients. Are any of the trials that we're talking about restricting access to Nudexta for anyone who enrolls?
No, I'm not aware that Nudexta is excluded. The Nudexta could be used. It's a symptomatic treatment for pseudobulbar affect. I want to also comment a little bit on the PLS question. I think the field is moving and it's becoming a reality. There will be a study that will target PLS patients to try and understand the natural history of PLS. An outcome measure has been developed but needs to be validated. So things are actually moving in the right track and doing all this is to be ready for an ALS and a PLS clinical trial. I also want to mention that in the platform, we can enroll patients who are possible ALS and within 3 years. So sometimes 1 or 2 PLS patients early in their disease may actually sneak in because they have not developed really the full-blown picture of PLS. So that I'm encouraged by that. So slower patient may be involved early on in the platform, and maybe after a while we'll have a better idea about what works in who, and maybe we can look at these patients, the possible slowly progressor, in a different way, maybe identify treatment that will work for them. And also as Sabrina said, when we do the platform trial, we're also doing the biomarker study, trying to understand a little bit more about the natural history of the disease so we can match that going back. So it's not, we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel a little bit. PLS is not the type of patient that we definitely will not look at because they progress slowly. Things are really changing and toward the right direction.
Dr. Wolfe.
Yeah, so the only thing that I would say in terms of PLS is to remember that it's not just ALS in a different form. We have done some questionnaire analysis on our PLS patients. And from a pulmonary and sleep perspective, what we found is a lot more daytime sleepiness as a part of the fatigue in these patients, and that they seem to benefit from mild doses of stimulants to help them have the energy that they need, whether that comes from the fact that working so hard with sort of weak muscles gives them more fatigue in general or not is unclear. But I do think that it's important that as we put trials together for PLS going forward, it's not just the other ALS. We need to think about it as its own disease.
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Siddiqui even pointed out, and I appreciate it because I didn't want to misstate the facts, although I almost said it initially, but the PLS registry that we started here at the Les Turner Foundation, and I think attributes to the vision that he had, combining neurogenetics and understanding why diseases happen, understanding the patient's genetics and individual factors would lead to different ways of treating the disease. And that was true, for, I think, as an example, when you look at the drug targets that are in platform, and you think about why they're even being studied, you think about what models they were developed in, and you really see the that foresight that was had, that this was a critical thing. And I was always, as a scientist, I got interested in ALS before I even met a person with ALS, and it was because I was interested, in part because there was a model, and I started hearing about the research and about how this disease worked. But I also, I think that, but that link comes up to a question I was getting, but I didn't know where to fit it in, about why the basic science matters so much to the Les Turner Foundation, to the Healy Center and MGH's program. Why does it matter so much that we have this? Because I know they have extremely strong, in fact, a product of MGH and Harvard's focus on preclinical research is Evangelos Kaskinis, who's with us, and who's now, and actually for that matter, Hande Ozdinler, who also came from Jeff Macklis's lab. So I think that has been true. It's been a way that's actually led to you see the payoff now with these clinical trials built around fundamentally excellent preclinical science. And so that collaboration and the fact that, just looking at the program today too, and all the scientists that we had speaking from different parts of the country, as well as I think a number of our preclinical researchers, was just really feeds the innovation. That being said, so the PLS registry, here is, I think, the largest one in the country. And thank you, Dr. Siddiq, for that. And then Dr. Wolfe, I want to ask you a question. We've talked about all these other ways that we've decided to treat ALS based on other mechanisms, but people have noticed in many of the talks that patients often die of respiratory failure. So what's being done to target breathing and respiratory failure as a treatment for ALS? Any clinical trials there? Anything we should know about?
What I think that we should know about is the changes that we're lobbying to go through Medicare right now. So the current standards in the US are to start non-invasive ventilation at 50% of vital capacity. But if you look at the Canadian standard, the NICE guidelines, the German and the French guidelines, everyone is now changing to a vital capacity of 80% plus symptoms. We are the last people on earth hanging on to this 50% number. And that's reflecting the research that's been done in the last 10 years, showing that early initiation of NIV makes a huge difference. And so we have presented that data to Medicare, and it's about to be written up for peer review. And we hope after that acceptance and a big change in what we do and how we do it. And I think that that's the biggest thing that's going to be tangible. In terms of direct trials, it's going to be challenging. The one thing that we are hoping for is that as other trials go forward, like the platform trials, that we'll be able to look at how patients do with NIV and see whether or not that makes an additional benefit. Because people are going to self-randomize, right? They're going to either use it or not use it based on their recommendations from their physician or whether they can tolerate it or not. And we're going to get an idea of how that works separately, similar to the discussion that Sabrina had previously as to things like edaravone or riluzole, which are considered so much standard of care that we can't we can no longer go in and take those out. But as the trials go forward, we can see how it impacts or does not impact sort of what's going on. In addition, people are going to see new airway clearance devices come on the market. We did a small trial a year ago looking at a device called the Medaneb, which combines vibrations and positive pressure with, medications to help liberate secretions in patients with ALS. And that device has now come on the market so that it can be clinically prescribed. And we're really happy with that additional emphasis on airway clearance and how it's making a difference for our patients.
Now I'm going to take Lizzie Cohen's question. How long will the Healy platform trial last and add new drugs? Is there an end date or a date when new therapies will stop being added to over the next few years? How do you project it out there, Dr. Paganoni?
Yeah, so the Healy trial is conceived and designed as a perpetual trial. That's part of the definition of platform trials, where the way it's set up in terms of the protocol is perpetual, meaning that you can add as many treatments as you want over whatever period of time as you want. So in theory, it can be perpetual. Again, it can go on, for a very long time and add, as many treatments as we want. Obviously, we hope that it's not going to be perpetual, in the sense that hopefully we will find a number of effective intervention that will make it, so that we don't need to run more trials. But in principle, yes, it is set up to continue. So in other words, there's no specified end date and there's no cap. The idea is that we continue to add the most promising drugs, continue to create spots for research so that, all people with ALS can participate in the trial.
And I'm going to take this pre-submitted question here about communication options beyond the Tobii Dynavox system for people who are either struggling to use it or it no longer works for. And so I'll say this is a really interesting area that I actually think we could devote more time to technology in ALS in the future. I know we've done it in the past with these symposiums, but it's a really exciting area because we're getting better and better at doing non-invasive recording from the brain to control devices. And this is relevant to spinal cord injury, to ALS and other diseases as well. And not to mention just how we all might engage in the future with our technology, even if we don't have even if we're otherwise, quote unquote, healthy. So, but there are a few options. We have a technology center at Shirley Ryan. There's also one at Marion Joy that's affiliated with Northwestern as well. I can tell you through the one that I'm more related to, or involved with at Shirley Ryan, that Ability Lab, that we have a few collaborations with both one with a company in Canada, one with a group in upstate New York for testing out devices in select patients. Very limited, but we have had a few people that we've tested out devices on, and we have the ability to kind of bring technology to patients, as well as there's now the C-STAR National Center here at Shirley Ryan Ability Lab as well for bringing technology to patients. So we're hoping to use that in the future for projects like putting sensors on our patients, making more accurate diagnosis, or like Dr. Paganoni was talking about, the critical importance of early biomarkers for picking up an early signal to a treatment effect. So I think that's an area that, as much as the biology is a key part of it, often I feel like as a biologist, I'm envious of engineering, because I feel like they sometimes solve problems at a faster rate than us. I know they seem to publish papers faster than I can, because they only have to get it to work once, and then they can publish a paper on that. I have to get it to work on 3 different, samples, and do it how many different times, and then and make it all kind of line up. So, but the engineers are incredible resource that I think through the collaboration on campus here, and we see it, I'm sure, examples in Boston between Spaulding and MGH too, that it's so key to have these allies working together. We're getting close to the end.
Colin?
It's 3:11. Dr. Wolfe, go ahead.
Can I just put one other shout out there? We are very aggressive about getting our patients something called SIP ventilation, which is where they can get a portable PAP machine that has a straw or a mouthpiece on the end of it. And patients throughout the day can sip or get a big breath that helps to really modulate and amplify their voice. It can help to make them better understood throughout the day. And so it doesn't replace the voice, but it does help to improve its function. And you will see us using those kinds of respiratory treatments to help with that.
We've taken about 50 questions since Dr. Paganoni's talk to now. So we've got a lot of participation, a lot of questions that have come in. Before I finish up, I wanted to give the panelists each a chance if they had any other comments or any other ideas that came up with the discussion, if they wanted to share with us, or else I'll have to say a few final things.
The only thing I would like to say is that it's, one good thing about COVID is that it has forced all of us to use webinars and this type of technology communications, these presentations more frequently. To the point that now, for example, we are doing a weekly webinar on the platform trial. I just want to say that it's so wonderful to be able to connect, frequently and in a seamless way with colleagues and especially with patients from other locations. And so hopefully we can continue to do this even more frequently. And certainly, I think it's really a new era. I mean, even just 1 year ago, we wouldn't have all these frequent kind of, webinars and forums from different organizations where we can take live questions, 50 questions, whatever, and people can really join and ask whatever questions they have. There's no, everyone is free to ask any of and all the questions they have. So I just want to say, kudos to you for organizing these and for making it happen, even in the virtual environment. And hopefully hopefully I'll come and visit you guys in Chicago very soon.
We would love that. I would just want to echo what Sabrina said, and 2020 has been an interesting year. However, it's been a great year for ALS. And I think in a way, because of the pandemic, we learned to do more efficient trials that are more patient-centric, take better care of the patient, and research continued despite all that. So I think those are things to celebrate going forward.
And I just wanted to say thank you very much to the Les Turner Foundation for putting this together. Thank you very much for my colleagues whom I have so much respect for, and I just really enjoy getting to hear you all talk today.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, and we got one more thank you in the Q&A. Thanks. I thought we had one last question coming in. Well, it's been an outstanding day. I had a really easy job because I didn't have to be all that prepared, unlike some of the speakers earlier on, as well as, what's really amazing is the amount of participation that we've had. Over 300 attendees from, admittedly, many of them from this area, but really when you saw some of the questions coming in, they were really from all over the world. This is going to live on YouTube and be able to be rewatched. So, some of our comments and ideas, we can see a few years from now who's got it right and whose ideas needed a little bit more work. But ideas and data are kind of the things that I love to personally to see. And I think we've had that in abundance today, thanks to Dr. Kalb, thanks to Lauren Webb, Telly Moore, who did all the behind the scenes work, quarterbacking the symposium. So I have to give them an early shout out. There's more information. I know that everyone kind of gets information overload. The lesturner.org website, of course, there's other websites too, but we try to make our platform helpful to direct people in our area to the appropriate resources. Thanks to all the speakers, and people showed unpublished data today. They show there's more collaboration that's possible because people aren't just showing their published works, but what's coming down the pipeline, the latest results. We had great speakers, both externally from all over the world and internally. Dr. Paganoni, I didn't get to have her as part of my Rehab Academy meeting session this year, but this made up for it because we get to work again this year. She worked with me last year at the AA PM&R meeting. She's in major demand. I think people realize this. And Dr. Just thinking about Andrea Backman, who invited her and had the foresight to get her here on the cusp of all the big, this has got to be the greatest year of your career with all the things that you guys have got going. I mean, last year probably was, and this year is again, and hopefully next year will be another best year of your career because you're been making such a difference. And the whole point of this is we couldn't even do this without all the patients, all the pals and their families who continue to support the event, to show the enthusiasm for us to kind of push forward. And of course, I think what gets overlooked sometimes, and I'll give a shout out to the people I work with in the clinic, our nurses, the medical assistants, Stephanie, our therapists, especially the ones who are there every week, all year long, and some who come and go. Genetic counselor, pulmonologist, Dr. Wolfe is here, but Dr. Coleman, that make our clinic so special, our dietitian, and then of course the Les Turner Foundation and the people who are out there doing field work for us, so they actually see patients virtually or in their homes, deliver care. Please take a minute to do the survey on, and the link is in the chat, and it's at the Survey Monkey on our symposium. This is the 10th year of doing it. And thank you also to Dr. Osdindler, who's done it the last 9 years, who's organized it. We haven't forgotten about you. And I can't really say anything else about today's event other than it just makes me excited to think about what's coming down the pipeline, what's going to happen next year at this event. And thank you very much and have a good day. And we'll look forward to doing it again soon.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Bye, everybody.